Hello and welcome to the Future of Journalism, the Fate of Democracy. My apologies for our little late start. We're having some issues getting the feed up on Facebook. But thank you for joining us. I'm Matthew Gibson, Director of Virginia Humanities. I'm especially pleased we could present this event with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Federation of State Humanities Councils. We also appreciate our presenting partners at Colorado Humanities, Humanities DC, Illinois Humanities, and the Society of Professional Journalists, Virginia Pro Chapter. Tonight's conversation is the first of two events. Both are part of a Mellon-funded national initiative named Democracy and the Informed Citizen. Many of our fellow humanities councils have presented programming as part of the initiative over the past year. At Virginia Humanities, we have focused our lens on the crucial need for accountable local journalism. In Virginia alone, we lost 39 weekly newspapers between 2004 and 2020, and 3 dailies, a 27% decrease in news publications statewide. Tonight's speakers will explore new vehicles of journalism across the country and how access to that reporting can offer viable and trustworthy replacements for the newspapers of old. But while I've got you, I also want to make a plug for the second event on June 22nd. Moderated by Karen Rundlet from the Knight Foundation, this panel will focus on the practitioners, many from the nonprofit sector, who are innovating in the journalism and media literacy space. They'll share the work of their organizations, including their successes and ongoing concerns. So please be on the lookout and register and attend. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we hand the program over to our speakers for today's event. One, please share your questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom. Two, this event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time during the event by using the closed captions tab at the bottom of your window. And three, if you haven't already read today's books, we hope that you will. For details about how to buy them from our bookseller for this event, the University of Virginia Bookstore, please visit vabook.org, where you can also explore our schedule of virtual events and watch past events. And now, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. They all have very extensive resumes in the practice and/or study of journalism. And for this venue, I will share brief bios. First, Margaret Sullivan is the media columnist for the Washington Post. Previously, she was the New York Times public editor and the chief editor of the Buffalo News. A graduate of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Sullivan has served on the Pulitzer Prize board and is the author of Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. And second, Penelope, or Penny, Abernathy is a visiting professor at Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism after serving 12 years as the Knight Chair in Journalism and Digital Media Economics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Formerly an executive with the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, she was a reporter and editor at several daily newspapers and has written numerous books and reports. She was inducted into the North Carolina Journalism Hall of Fame in 1998. And third, Greg Moore, Executive Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of Deke Digital, has more than 40 years of experience in news operations, including Editor-in-Chief of the Denver Post for 14 years, guiding the newspaper to 4 consecutive Pulitzer Prizes. He served as managing editor of the Boston Globe, co-chaired the Pulitzer Prize board, and received the Benjamin C. Bradley Editor of the Year Award from the National Press Foundation. In 2018, he was inducted into the Denver Press Club Hall of Fame. And last but not least, Karen Rundlet is director of the journalism program at the Knight Foundation. Her focus is on investing in new methods and models to advance excellence in journalism and civic media as a way to support informed local communities. Previously, she worked as a journalist at the Miami Herald, contributed business reports to various public radio newsrooms, and began her career as a television news producer in the Miami, Atlanta, and New York markets. And finally, our moderator tonight is Phoebe Stein, president of the Federation of State Humanities Councils. Previously, Phoebe served as executive director of Maryland Humanities and as an advocate for the humanities at local, state, and federal levels for more than 20 years. She served on the Federation Board of Directors, and in 2016, she was recognized as one of Maryland's top 100 women by the Daily Record. So thank you all for joining us today. And Phoebe, I'll turn this over to you now.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for the introductions and for your service on the Federation board that I want to note. And I want to thank the Virginia Humanities Council staff, Jane and Trey and Megan and Kathleen for all the work they did to prepare for today. And a special thanks to Jane for all she did to support me for tonight's conversation. First, I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in this evening from Washington, D.C. on the ancestral lands of the Anacostia, also documented as the Nacotcheng peoples, and the ancestral lands of the Piscataway. And that today, roughly 4,000 Indigenous people live and thrive in the Washington, D.C. area. Speaking with my Federation hat on, we are honored to support democracy and the informed citizen and programs like this one through 2 successive grants from the Mellon Foundation. I am always in awe of what the Humanities Councils produce in response to a national call to use the lens of the humanities to talk about the most pressing issues of today. The overall theme for our discussion this evening, the future of journalism and democracy, offers a widely reported topic, including local newspaper deserts, media literacy, misinformation and disinformation, consolidation of the industry, combined with the loss of advertisers and subscribers, and all of this, the impact of all of this on our operating democracy. So tonight, we're going to examine the topic of journalism and democracy through a public humanities focus, which touches on how the humanities undergird all the aspects of the issues we will be talking about, including civics, history, tech and media studies, the arts, the culture of local newspapers with their community-based aspects of op-eds and columns and letters to the editor. But I will say on a more personal note, my husband worked at the Baltimore Sun for 25 years, mostly on the city desk, before taking a buyout 20 years ago. He loves to remind me that at the height of the Baltimore Sun, they had 8 foreign bureaus. He likes to say that almost every day. He was among the last of his colleagues to have the opportunity for a buyout. Most of his colleagues were shown the door without compensation. Right now, the future of the Sun is uncertain. I can highly recommend the reporting of Justin Fenton and his new book about the Baltimore Police Department's Gun Trace Task Force. This is reporting that Tom Rosenstiel would call reporting on, quote, massive abuse of power at the local level. That's a quote that I gleaned from Margaret's book today. And so we all know local reporting matters, but it certainly does in Baltimore. I want to thank our distinguished panelists who are advancing democracy by ensuring the future of journalism through their work. And I'm going to begin with one question for each of you as we explore the topic and then come back to some possible solutions as well. So for Karen, good evening. The Knight Foundation's goal is to foster informed and engaged communities, which we believe are essential for a healthy democracy. So I wonder if you could kind of open with this initial context. Why did the Knight Foundation take on this goal? And what does it take to foster informed and engaged communities?
Thanks, Phoebe. Hi, everyone. Yes, informed and engaged communities are central to our strategy and our mission statement. And oftentimes when I say those words, people are searching for deeper understanding. But once I say, what's the alternative? Misinformed or uninformed communities, they get it in an instant. And especially after this last year and change that we've been through, and we've seen what's happened when communities are misinformed, uninformed. We know that it can be a life or death situation in terms of the pandemic. If you didn't get the right information and do the right things, it costs lives for people. What the Knight Foundation decided in 2019 to invest $300 million over 5 years into local news because that's where we saw the opportunity. Frankly, there are a lot of national outlets that are doing quite well. And we really see the opportunity at the local level, because there's trust there. There's so much research that shows that people still trust local news organizations. And the other reason is because there are an increasing number of news deserts across the country, and we're concerned about that. And if people aren't informed and engaged, what effects that has on democracy.
Thanks so much, Karen. Margaret, I want to turn to you through your book, Ghosting the News, which there's a link in the chat. It's a wonderful book. You try to help Americans understand the severity of the loss of accountability journalism. What do you see as the deepest consequences to the critical shortage of real news?
Well, I think that we're in thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And thank you, Phoebe, for the question. And hi, everybody. You know, I'm worried about where we are right now in the United States. I feel as though it's not just I feel as though, the truth is that we no longer have a common basis of facts that are shared generally among the citizenry or the electorate. And as a result, you know, we see something happen like what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And we see now as people are trying to, you know, are getting arrested and trying to defend themselves. And what they're saying is, but I was misled. I didn't know the facts. I didn't understand what was happening. Now, this may or may not be true, but that's part of what is being sort of posited. And I think that this is only going in one direction. So, you know, while there was a time when everybody kind of, you know, generally had the same basis of reality to deal with, it seems as though every day that goes by, we are more and more split into people who are basically tuned into reality and people who are not. And it's a really dangerous situation. It's the kind of situation that leads to a democracy being, you know, actually disintegrating. And I think we're looking at it right now. So it's, you know, I come out of local news, even though everybody thinks when they look at my resume or when they hear it, it's sort of like, oh, Washington Post, New York Times. But the truth is I spent you know, sort of a bit like Greg, I was the editor of it happened to be my hometown paper, the Buffalo News, for 13 years. And it was a place where I had already been as a reporter and an editor for a long time. And I mean, I would just say maybe this is a way to get it across. Most of the time that I was there as a reporter, as a city desk editor, as a features editor, there were 200 people in the newsroom. And when I left in 2012 to go be the internal watchdog at the New York Times, the public editor, we had to trim down some, and we were at about 145. Mm-hmm. But right now, and it's less than a decade later, I think that it would be a stretch to say they have 50 people in that newsroom. And, you know, one of the examples I give in my book isn't indeed about Denver, where the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post each had some 300 or more people in their newsrooms. And it wasn't really that long ago. And then the Rocky went out of business, and the Post is owned, if I'm not mistaken, by Alden Global. And they're they're a hedge fund, and they do terrible things. So, you know, I think we need to be careful not to equate local journalism only with local newspapers. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of other ways to go at it. And I'm always very careful to say that, especially because I really believe in newspapers still. Mm-hmm. But, you know, we haven't yet built up the substitutes that would fill in the gaps. And I'm not convinced that we're going to be fully able to at any point. So, you know, one of the things that happens, I won't go on too long, but I'll just name a couple things. People become, when there's not trustworthy local news, people become more polarized in their voting. They don't cross party lines to vote. They become more tribal, and we're already pretty tribal as it is. They become less politically engaged. And, you know, the truth is they sort of rely on whatever comes across their social media feed or whatever comes into their phone through whatever it is, that sort of becomes their news source. And that's, I think, a very dangerous situation. So that's what I'm worried about.
Thank you. Thank you. To you, Penny, you've worked on many sides of these topics and issues as a journalist in business operations, as we heard, and strategic planning, and also through deep academic research, of course, and reports. What should we know about your current research?
Thanks, Phoebe. I think what I'm going to try to do is make a bridge to what Margaret just said, do a kind of cause and effect. And what is the cause? The cause is the for-profit business model that sustained local news for 250 years and nurtured our democracy has collapsed. It collapsed beginning around 2005, and it basically, the problem is there has not been a substitute that has been developed so far that replaces what was lost by the for-profit collapse. And that poses, I think, a lot of questions and that we need to think about as we think about what makes for an informed and engaged society. So a lot of my research over the last 15 years has focused on what are developing business models? What do we know about what it takes to have sustainable news models at the local level? And there are three things, and I think we need to think about them and use the flip side. So one, so much of the ability to have a sustainable business model, especially in small and mid-sized markets, revolves around the economic demographics of that market. So are the population demographics of that market. So a market that has above average or average expectations of economic growth or population growth, there's a good chance you can probably develop some sort of sustainable business model, maybe a for-profit, nonprofit, or some hybrid. But that is dependent on the second kind of corollary. You need to, it depends on the ownership. You need an owner that has the mandate to both understand and meet the needs and expectations of the people who live and work in that community. And then that in turn relies on the third point, which is you also need the available capital. One of the things I have seen repeatedly is that people think a lot about what it takes to start a news site, what it takes to buy a newspaper, but do not think about the capital that's needed to invest in experimentation. Because in the end, there's not going to be one business model as there was a dominant business model prior to this. There are going to be many, and it's going to be about the market, the people, and the needs and the expectations going forward. My research has shown, and this I think is the part that we need to think about as we think about covering the various needs, communication needs we have in the 20th century. The markets that are most likely to have lost a news outlet, usually a newspaper, were much, much poorer and much, much older than the markets that have an existing newspaper or an existing outlet. And the other part that we really need to think about is that, you know, there was a hope, and I had this same hope a decade and a half ago, is that, okay, the newspaper as we knew it in the 20th century kind of falls, but transitions over into some kind of digital presence. We need to think about the notion that we rarely have digital substitutes or any other kind of substitute that goes into those markets that we have, where we've lost a newspaper. And in addition, we need to really think about how we not only engage people in those markets with a news outlet, we need to think about how we reach them. I mean, I live on a farm, so I'm keenly aware, I'm sure Margaret is too, from wherever you are. If you're not connected to broadband, that has huge limitations as to what you can actually receive and engage with in this digital age.
Thank you so much. So I'm shifting to you, Greg, and talking about ownership of papers. Does the, I use the phrase news industrial complex through which the industry is moving towards the 4 or 5 big newspaper owners, does this undermine journalism at the local level, or does it support it?
I think the evidence is the former, that it has undermined local journalism, and the local news ecosystem as we know it, is in great peril. The outlook is not great. I mean, what we've seen with Alden Global Capital and Gatehouse and some of the others that have taken over some of these large newspaper chains, it's almost like it's in a playbook. Immediately begin to cut expenses, don't invest in the news product, don't invest in technology, they don't invest in trying to grow revenue, but they are still committed to exacting profits. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand is that for these remaining newspapers in particular, they still have very healthy profit margins. I mean, profit margins that are in the 18, 19, 22, 23% range. And the way that they achieve that is not investing anything but cutting expenses. And so when you look at the recent purchase by Alden Global Capital, which owns the Denver Post, the San Jose Mercury News, and a number of other newspapers, the first thing that they did, the very first thing they did after the deal closed was fire the CEO and put the head of Alden Global in control as the CEO, and immediately offered buyouts to everyone. In fact, they sweetened the buyouts in hopes of being able to get more people to depart the organization. So the outlook is not good. It is it's not healthy, as Margaret said, for our democracy. And I think these local communities are suffering in ways large and small, not just with the lack of accountability reporting, but having a sense of who they are as communities. One of the things that newspapers and other news organizations did was they talked about and wrote about and reported on the up-and-comers in the communities. They reported on the people who were doing good deeds. They pointed out problems that, would force a person to get up out of their chair, go write a check, or go volunteer to make a difference in their communities. They've lost the ability to see themselves and to see what they can become. And so, I think as Margaret said, we're at a very dangerous point, not just for our democracy, but for, our sense of ourselves as communities.
Thank you, Greg. You've certainly made it very clear what's at stake here. And I love this idea that part of this is losing an ability to see what you're capable of, the future options. I'm going to turn to very briefly to a couple of positive examples of public humanities programming that are going around in the sector here through this Mellon-funded project, Democracy and the Informed Citizen. So these are programs that took place, as you heard from Matthew, over 50 states and territories. But Georgia Humanities Council put together a media literacy guidebook. These are ways in which the state councils are trying to kind of fill this gap in a way, or at least talk about the issues. That's a guidebook, How Journalists and the Public Shape Our Democracy, with a partnership through Atlanta Press Club and the University of Georgia. California Humanities actually supported a emerging journalism fellowship for 31 student journalists at 8 community colleges, an interesting program. And then Louisiana Humanities really looked at the representation of race and African-American and Afro-Creole experiences of citizenship and civil rights through the media. So doing some media kind of modeling what it looks like to examine, to scrutinize the media and really talk about what you learned. So I'm wondering what examples do you see working? And I'm thinking about I think I heard the number 300 million from Karen, that investment. How is that getting closer to the models that I think I heard Margaret and Penny say we're not quite there yet?
So we're trying to solve a lot of different problems. So I think that there's a business model problem, and then there's just a lack of reporters problem. So, I mean, things that we've invested in that we think are moving the needle, we've invested in Report for America, for instance, and that's an organization that's putting reporters back in local newsrooms across the United States. Not all of them are newspapers. Some of them are digital startups. Some of them are public radio stations. Some of them are television stations. So that's one example of something good that's happening, and you have to have a match. So they have to raise funds, and you raise part of the funds to support this salaried reporter from the community. So there's community buy-in and belief around the topic, the general beat, the general focus area of the reporting. That's one example. Around the business model, there certainly is a move towards philanthropy supporting different organizations. There are hundreds of nonprofit news organizations, and some of them report exclusively about topic. Some of them are local, some of them are state house, some of them are national. So that's definitely something that has really emerged in the last 10 plus years. It's still fairly new. And there's successful outlets like VT Digger or MinPost. One of the best known organizations is the Texas Tribune for that kind of work. But some of this work is more difficult, as Penny pointed out before, in communities where there isn't necessarily a high income or an upper middle income demographic. So there's some other really innovative models. I just want to mention one more quickly. There's an organization called City Bureau. It is in Chicago, and they thought that Black communities, the Black community, Black and brown communities were not well covered. And they created a model where they said, you know what, we're going to teach residents how to go to public meetings and how to take notes and what their rights are. And it's citizen reporting. They're taking notes. They're not producing stories, but some of those notes are then used by journalists in their coverage. And so it's creating a civic awareness and providing skills. And by the way, all these folks who go to take notes, they're paid. So which is another thing that contributes to the equity of the program. It's not just volunteers, it's people who are paid for their time and valued for their contributions. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, I had sort of a follow-on question because, and it relates to the City Bureau, but I was thinking about more broadly how structural racism and white supremacy sort of figure into the past and present and future of journalism. I mean, I know that's a really big, in democracy, it's kind of a big question, but
a big question. So I'm going to make everybody answer that one with
pieces.
me. I will look. Last summer we had racial justice protests around the world, in this country, but around the world, and there was Black and brown journalists were very angry, and all this. There are many different examples of. There's a list that was actually collected by Neiman Lab at Harvard University of journalists on social media saying, "We told you, we tried to get this covered. You didn't hear us. You didn't respect the truths that we were telling you that were coming from our community." So I think there is a real tension right now that's being discussed. It's in recent years, I would say, and I don't think it's only about race. I think it's actually also about generation. I think that we're really looking at the word objectivity, and we're saying, what the heck does this mean? What does this? Whose objectivity? Whose side? Whose truth? Whose both sidesism? And that's coming out in a very different way. And that's coming out in a very different way from Black and brown journalists and leaders in newsrooms. That's one of the values that I think is really being tested right now and questioned, and like a monument in some places it's being pulled down, and new organizations are being formed and saying it's about transparency, it's about acknowledging that people have points of view. So that's one thing I would mention.
I would just add that the media has never really been all that great when it comes to covering underserved communities, people of color, income disparities. I mean, most people in this country know very little about what it's like to live in rural America, and that's because the media, even on the local level, we're so busy covering the establishment, the power structure, which I understand. But, I think this is an opportunity for us to not just look at the business model, but for us to look at, how communities of interest get covered and who gets to tell those stories. And one of my main concerns right now is that while new verticals are being created, new organizations are being built, they are largely almost all white. And we're making the exact same mistakes that were made in before the 1970s, when newsrooms, television stations, newspapers opened their doors to people of color and women. We're making the exact same mistake. And I think it's really important that we talk about, inclusion, who gets to tell the stories, what kind of stories get told, who greenlights them, and that kind of thing, in addition to talking about what the business model should be. On the business model thing, I 15 years ago, I can't imagine I would ever say this, but I really, really think that, the thing that Penny talked about is really troubling when you really think about it. Communities that don't have, particular, affluence or what have you, they run the risk of maybe not having local journalism that they can rely on. We can't allow that to happen. And one of the things that I never thought I'd hear myself say is that tax-supported journalism, I think, is the way to go. I mean, I think there are other ways, foundations and not-for-profits like ProPublica, which do great journalism. But I think we have to really look at this and say that if, in fact, local news is so important to our democracy and our communities across this country, then we have to find a way to support it through tax dollars, like we support other vital services to our communities. And we forget that, in the old model that's so celebrated, 80% of the cost of, local newsrooms was borne by advertisers, 20% were borne by taxpayers through circulation. And we do have models where we know that taxpayer-supported journalism works. It works with the BBC, it works with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Canada is already experimenting with taxpayer-supported journalism. New Jersey is, and a number of other places. And the challenge is to find a way to make it work, to create a firewall where there's not undue influence by those that hold the purse string. But, we were certainly able to do that with advertisers, and anybody who thinks that advertisers didn't try to influence the outcome of news coverage, they're crazy. And so I think, if we can get the right minds in a room together, I think the quickest way to sort of get to a place where we can preserve what's left or preserve what comes next is to figure out a model where, taxpayer-supported journalism is part of the mix.
I'm like Greg. I never would have thought I would have said this, but as I have looked at how things have evolved over the last 15 years, I have to go back to, we have relied on journalism in this country to both nurture democracy at the grassroots level and also build community. So it gets back to Margaret's point about the polarization here. In this age of loss of local news. And I think that, one of the things I love is Knight's commitment 2 years ago to the 300 million, with a significant push to philanthropy to start thinking about news as a humanity, as a resource in a community that builds community, in addition to informing us. One of the things that has concerned me, picking back up on what Greg was saying, is that first off, philanthropy has not historically looked that way. A very small proportion has gone to news versus other needs. But if you look at where most of the philanthropy is located, it's in these old industrial centers where you had family foundations, where you have community foundations. And so, I'm looking at a recent example of the Reynolds Trust in North Carolina, basically giving a major grant to a paper that in Columbus County that won the Pulitzer Public Service Award back in 1953 for taking on the Ku Klux Klan. It's a small weekly, and they have basically given them a major grant to take their coverage and think about how 4 counties, the 4 poorest counties in North Carolina, they're also heavily majority minority, has the largest population of Native Americans east of the Mississippi, has a second, they're heavily African American and also growing in Hispanic representation, and think about how you do the stories that help those regions, that provide those citizens in that area with the news that they need, that is contextual and analytical and helps them to begin to solve those problems. One of the most interesting dilemmas they faced is that they're not setting themselves up to compete against the other 3 papers or the other 3 news outlets, which are owned by a private equity company. They are actually trying to collaborate with them because their notion is what's more important at the end of the day is if they can support the 4 journalists who are working there to provide better news and at least show up and cover, give them the support to show up and cover the town council or the county commissioner while they're providing the big picture story. So I think there are a lot of questions we need to answer internally as journalists, whether we are in a news outlet. What are we doing to bind people together, not just in a particular city or particular county, but in a particular region? Because you've got to have the binding together in order to come up with solutions to the problem. But also, you know, what are we thinking about in terms of what we support? What are the philanthropies that we support? What are the organizations we support? And what do we ultimately conclude, as Greg said, is what is our obligation as citizens to make sure that information gets to people in low information areas?
So we do have a question from a participant that is intrigued by this tax-supported journalism idea. How would there be, how might we gain political support for that idea?
I guess I can jump in here a bit.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. You might think that politicians would be the last people who would want to support local journalism because, after all, it's going to be their feet who are held to the fire. But in fact, there's actually quite a bit of bipartisan support for local journalism in Congress. And there are a number of things on the table right now that again do have bipartisan support. And I think that, you know, part of that is that elected officials realize that if they're going to get people to care about the issues, if they're going to get people to come to the polls, if they're going to have an ability to govern in any way, they have to have local news. So it's not quite as, that part of it is not quite as dire. I mean, just one piece of this, you know, I think the question that we have to answer with taxpayer support or government support is how can we maintain our independence? That's key. So how can we maintain our independence? Because we know that we've been through the Trump administration in which there was such harsh criticism of particular news organizations. And if President Trump could have withdrawn support, you know, let's just say that the Washington Post was being run by federal support, you know, that would have ended. And what happened at the Voice of America, which did have there was an ability on the part of the president and the administration to get in there and change the way coverage happened. I mean, we really need to guard against that. But there are, as Penny and as Greg and as Karen have said, there are ways to build in safeguards. And there are also ways to get, provide funding that aren't direct, it's not just sort of direct, here's a bunch of money. For example, there are there's the idea of tax credits that would allow you to, use a tax credit to support your local news organization, whatever it may be. And I think, a big picture point that I'd like to make with all of this is that we have to think not in terms of, we used to have a workable model. Maybe it wasn't the greatest journalism for every community all the time. but we had a business model that worked. In fact, it worked to 30 or 35% profit margins. We're not going to have that anymore. We have to have kind of a patchwork approach that, uses every available way of funding and getting news organizations up and running. And, one of the things that is really important is collaboration. And this is something that, as journalists, we never were really all that comfortable with. We like to compete against each other, not collaborate with each other. But, and I'll just mention one of them that I admire, which is an organization that is collaborative that I admire, which is Spotlight PA. So Spotlight, one of the really difficult things that's happened is that State House coverage has really gone down dramatically. A lot of papers don't have a State House bureau, and there's just so much that affects our lives happens at the state level. And so Spotlight PA combines a bunch of different news organizations to do coverage by collaboration, that then the work is shared by a bunch of newspapers, radio stations, and others. And the more of that kind of thing we can see happen, I think the better off we'll be. And so we really need to think about things differently, not always about competing, but about getting together. And
so that is sort of leads into my next question, which is about what are effective ways to support future journalists. It sounds like, and Penny, are you visiting in Medill right now? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
I'm just thinking, does that mean that Margaret, the training for journalists needs to be a little bit different, that they need to begin from a collaborative place? I don't know what that looks like or what journalism schools are doing. And then I have a question later about citizen journalists and things. So.
Yeah, that's an intriguing question about how journalists should be trained differently. I'm not as close to it, I think, as Penny is. So maybe she can handle that one.
Well, I think that part of the realization of the last 10 years is that you need to train journalists to be flexible, be entrepreneurial and innovative, right? But you've also got to have a clear sense of the community and what kind of business model you can build on that. I taught courses on how to think about both strategy and business models that were heavily subscribed to by journalists, because I think that is you go into journalism, I think, as most of us did, because of some sort of mission and passion. You go in for the mission. And what we've had to struggle with, and we didn't have to think about when I became a journalist, was how the money was made. We just had to argue that we deserved a part of that money to go cover the news. And I think that we really have to think carefully, not only about how we put the business model together, but what's not being covered. And what is the responsibility at each news organization to cover that, right? One of the things that has that so concerns me about the loss of reporters at the Buffalo paper, for instance, or at the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina, is if you go from 300 at the Raleigh paper down to about 50, by necessity, the journalism contracts right around the metro area of Raleigh and Charlotte. So you're no longer circulating in 58 counties in eastern North Carolina. And I used to think about it this way: if you lose a local newspaper, you're losing the person who showed up to cover the county commissioners or the school board. When you lose reporters at state news outlets, whether that's a television station, whether that's a digital outlet like the Texas Tribune, or whether that is a regional newspaper, you're losing the people that taught you how you were related to people in other parts of the state, how you shared the same problems and possibilities. And it enabled you, those beat reporters, those investigative reporters, they enabled you to kind of put together a program to solve the issues that were right before you. So I think collaboration is a big umbrella word that Margaret is using, that talks about not only how you train journalists to think collaboratively, but how you train them to think collaboratively about what the possibilities are and what's not being covered.
We had another question from, excuse me, from an attendee that asked about, could the FCC help with ensuring or enforcing ethical and practical standards of journalism? Should the government take a larger role? Margaret?
I mean, something that, I write about this stuff all the time because I write a column about the media in the Washington Post. And often when I identify problems, people will write in the comments or write notes to me or whatever and say, we need to bring back the fairness doctrine, because they think that sounds good. And actually something called a fairness doctrine sounds pretty good, but I don't think we want the government involved in content, especially at this moment of our national history when we are so, I think it's sort of a cop-out to say we're polarized in some ways. We're so split between reality and unreality. It's not just partisan. I worry about the effects of that. And I don't think that bringing back what may or may not have worked in the 1980s makes any sense right now. And I would be very, I do think that we need to regulate social media better, and that there are reforms that can be made there that will limit and control disinformation. But I would be very worried about, you don't know who's going to be in office and who's going to be in control of making those decisions. And again, it's our independence that is the most important thing we have, our independence and our credibility. So I would be very, very concerned about giving up any of that. I mean, the rest of you may feel differently.
Well, no, I don't feel any differently about that. I think, you could have, there are a lot of different ways to do it. You could have a checkoff system on your income tax return where, you donate $10 to a fund that would support local journalism, or, you'd have a voter referendum on, setting aside a certain amount of money and have an independent board that would sort of administer that money in some ways. There are a lot of ways for us to think about doing it, but yes, absolutely. We want to make sure that, we protect our independence, because that's the key to our credibility and our ability to deliver quality journalism. So I know we can figure it out. We just got to get the right people at the table.
This is
one.
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
As we talk about this, and it's very important to talk about it, it's great to have this kind of session, and it's great to hear other people's ideas. I'm always struck by, the fact that it's moving so fast. The disaster is moving so fast in local journalism, and the solutions are slow to, necessarily, they need to be done thoughtfully. But, when you see Alden Global Capital take over the Chicago Tribune papers, which just has happened, that's just one example. I talk to people all the time who are at papers or news organizations that used to have big staffs, and they're totally shrunk to almost nothing. I feel like it's disturbing to me, because I feel like by the time we figure out how to fix it or how to shore things up, that so much of the kind of basic infrastructure and the talent will have drifted away. So that's a real concern I have.
Yeah, that's sort of also that question I had about sort of supporting future journalists. I hope there are future journalists. I know folks who teach them, but I would say that
I'm actually always amazed and heartened by the fact that there are still so many young people who find the field super compelling. I just taught a course all online at Duke University this past semester, and the name of it was I love this name, The News as a Moral Battleground. And, these kids are really interested. They would, if they could find the jobs, they would all be journalists.
So I have a question about, I've been thinking about this. collaboration that needs to happen. And then I was reading just a little bit of the first article in the Columbia Journalism Review's recent, what is journalism, this existential issue. Very, very interesting. And there was Claire Wardle in there talked about this participatory ecosystem where people are told that they can play a role in finding out the truth, that they can find clues to the puzzle. So that's sort of I can't tell if that's the upside or the downside. She teaches at Harvard about user-generated content, right? So we have sort of the citizen journalism, but I could see there could be a darker side to thinking like, I'm going to figure this out today. Like I'm going to go on the internet and figure out this conspiracy thing, and I can find the clues, and it's just like a puzzle, as opposed to I need to research, I need to talk to all these people, I need to get firsthand accounts. What can any of you talk about sort of the tension between, and I was fascinated by all the profiles of all those content producers in that Columbia Journalism Review piece that of course I'd never heard of. You probably have, but is there a tension between sort of this participatory model and this collaborative model?
So I'll take that. I haven't read the Columbia Journalism Review, but I don't think there's any tension there. I think, it's a plus situation, right? Like, I've talked to people about this. I get a lot of information from next door. Okay, like I could find out that there are porch pirates stealing things. There are people sliding under trucks and stealing catalytic converters. I first found that out, not in the New York Times or my local newspaper. I found that out on Nextdoor, but that's not news. Okay, like I mean, when we're talking about the kind of news that our communities need, we're talking about resources. That's what it really comes down to. It comes down to reporters, it comes down to editors, it comes down to judgment, it comes down to, credibility and independence and understanding what that means. And it comes down to money. You have to be able, as a news organization, to go up against a government or go up against a private entity that doesn't want you to have that information. And you have to have the ability to go to court to fight for it. For example, today, ProPublica did an impressive piece of journalism about the top 25 billionaires in this country that, pay 0.1% in taxes. Like, there's no citizen journalist out there that can do that, right? It takes a properly resourced, well-trained, fact-checking, repertorial operation to produce that kind of high-impact journalism. And, we're talking about being able to do that on the local level. And so Margaret's concern is real, that if we allow these organizations to wither to nothing, you probably won't be able to recreate them. And so there is a sense of urgency around it, but we shouldn't confuse someone working out of their business who's curious about how the school budget was spent, $10 million was spent, on books. That's not what we're talking about here. That can be added to the ecosystem. I think there's some value in that, but those people are not trained. They don't have the understanding of fact checking, which is sort of what really the science of objectivity is fact checking, so that if I have come to a conclusion and I'm transparent about the facts I used and the documentation that I relied upon, that Margaret can look at that same information and come to a similar conclusion. It's like what we expect in peer-reviewed, scientific experiments. That's what objectivity really is. And so I don't want us to, think citizen journalist is the answer to this, because they can't replace what those 5 reporters did at ProPublica, spending over 6 or 7 months authenticating those documents and weaving them into a coherent narrative that we can understand and hopefully act on.
Plus the lawyers.
I
mean, you can't, not just anybody can do that. I have a short part of my book about an organization in East Lansing, Michigan called East Lansing Information, which is really interesting. I mean, it's a woman who is a PhD, not a journalist, but she decided to sort of set up a citizen journalist organization but she went at it not just like, oh, we're going to just see what people say after they come back from a meeting. I mean, she trained people. She trained herself and trained other people to do legitimate reporting, and they do have, the resources to back it up. And I remember saying to her, but I don't know that this could happen in every community, because every community doesn't have a you. And she said, well, that's true, but people bring their own strengths to things. So, I mean, I personally am still a huge fan and of local newspapers and traditional news organizations that know how to do it. And they are, even in their desiccated, shrunken, ghosted out states, they are still the ones doing the best work. I mean, it's really remarkable. Not all of the best work. A lot of good work is coming out of the new digital startups, but in many cases, the best enterprise or the best investigative work is happening at newspapers where there's still a lot of institutional knowledge and they know how to do it. And so my feeling is, let's try to shore these places up so that we've got something to save.
Yeah, I think about the Healthy Holly, the mayor's, the unbelievable reporting. Karen, you were nodding your head before when I think Margaret was mentioning the Lansing project.
Yes, I mean, I know the newsroom, I know the leader. It's a really inspiring story. And look, I think too that she's definitely somebody with a lot of grit and a lot of determination, and created a public newsroom. And that is happening elsewhere in the country, where there is somebody who is really championing this and creating, looking at neighbors who want to be informed and teaching them skills, so that because, again, I've got to go back to Penny's point about news organizations have existed and survived where there were higher socioeconomic, communities, and there were small businesses to advertise. And so, I've always been impressed with what Alice did. And there are a few other leaders who've done that as well. So, yeah.
Can I pick up on what Margaret said, and also Craig did too? And this comment has haunted me since I wrote my first book. But one of the editors of an independent paper said that the difference between operating at a 20% margin and operating in the low single digits is he mentally had to catch himself each time he was doing a controversial story and saying, "Will I prevail? Can I afford the lawyer to get the Freedom of Information Act going so that I can do it?" And I mean, I think it occurred very dramatically last year when the local newspapers were having trouble getting information on COVID, and they basically all had to go together, contribute $10,000 a piece to go hire the lawyer to actually take on the state health department. The state health department wasn't aware that the county health departments weren't sharing that. But I mean, it is one of those things when we're talking again about thinking collaboratively, that probably would not have happened before. The News and Observer or the Charlotte paper would have gone straight in there. But I mean, if you think about these small digital outlets, if you think about anything else as a startup or a nonprofit, you've got to have those legal resources to get what you really need to do. That's what a professional journalist brings to the organization.
Yeah. If, say, you had to take on the Catholic Church or something, Greg, maybe,
Right.
just for example. A question from an attendee about what about state support for community newspapers? I mean, I'm thinking about now the effect of COVID on state budgets, but in a healthier state budget situation, state grants, perhaps even to local colleges, or I think this participant is trying to think about, networks of support that happen in other ways that people get funded.
I mean, it's the same issue, although maybe more extreme because, state politicians and elected officials are are again pretty sensitive to what is going to be covered. And, you know, I would love to think that everyone would rise above that, but I think we know too much about human nature to really believe it. And so I worry. I think the more local the funding is, and the more specific it is, the greater the concern. But, you know, I think we need to consider everything too.
I think the good part, though, that we do see several state legislators forming task forces, and also, just as we have in Congress, bipartisan support for legislation that tries to establish that news organizations are a public trust. And I mean, the Connecticut legislature, for instance, anticipating that Alden might own the Hartford Courant, had a bipartisan support for a bill that basically tried to limit the ability to saddle the company with the debt, the Hartford Courant with debt. That's the oldest continuously publishing newspaper in the country. And it was interesting to me. I was asked to testify before it, and I was stunned, back to Margaret's point, of the bipartisan support. And part of it is the legislatures didn't have any way to get their message out once the Hartford Courant was gone. So, I mean, there is to me, the most encouraging part about the kind of journey I've been on for the last 15 years is that, you know, you've not only got an awareness in the industry of what is at stake and in the profession, but I think there is a growing awareness from Congress on down to the ordinary citizen of what's been lost and what could be lost further if we don't come up with something to solve this.
We had a question from another attendee that said, you know, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, will we see this quotidian journalism? Will we see the local stories again, the covering of the city council, not just the investigative journalism, which we obviously need, but what might need to happen from all that we've been talking about for that to happen again?
You know, I'm an optimist, right? And so, you know, I've said, you know, the stagecoach was replaced by the locomotive was replaced by the airplane. Local newspapers will be replaced by something. I mean, there will be something. I don't know what it will be, but there will be something. The hunger to understand, you know, why things happen, you know, who's behind them, what does it mean, that's never going to go away. And I think that, you know, we've just had a reminder of what happens when you have a breakdown in the democratic system. And I'm talking about all the institutions, the Congress, the courts, the journalism. When you have that breakdown, you get January 6th. And I think that having that stark reminder there, that's our version of War of the Worlds, the radio broadcast that scared the hell out of everybody. And I think that it will breed a kind of creativity and innovation and things of that nature that's going to be really, really important to figuring out what comes next. Look, the big thing that's staring us in the face is social media and the role that Facebook and Google have played in the demise of the local news ecosystem. In the end, these two massive, rich corporations who actually feed on local news, and believe it or not, people come to their sites for news, not to see who's, you know, playing with their cat in their pajamas. That it's in their business interest to figure out a way to support the revival of the local news franchise. And it's not with, you know, $300 million, you know, donation here or $500 million there. They control 90% of the advertising that has disappeared from local newspapers across this country. We're talking about big dollars. And if they want their businesses to survive well into the future, they need to be part of the solution about how we solve this problem and how we reinvent that next iteration of the local news ecosystem here. And I don't think we should let them off the hook. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars that are really required to sort of bring us back from the brink.
You know, that's absolutely right. The truth is the money is there, including the advertising dollars. It's there. It's just that it's been siphoned off to the so-called duopoly. And there is a bill that's being considered in Congress that would at least give local publishers, meaning newspapers and others, the ability to bargain together. It would be an antitrust exemption, right, to bargain together so that they have some kind of leverage. You know, we used to kind of think, well, yes, print advertising is going away, but digital will fill the gap. Well, that turned out to be a massive joke. It just hasn't happened. And a big part of that is that Google and Facebook sucked it all up.
We did have a question here about what about super rich benefactors? We're talking about money. There is money like Bezos, Patrick Soon-Shiong at Xiong at the LA Times. I mean, I also was thinking about the families like the Hearsts and, you know, it was the Abels in Baltimore and, you know, just, and we could go on, but, you know, we have had capitalists running the newspapers for a long time. Is that part of the answer in combination? I don't.
Oh, I'm not going to use the name here, but I had a person who's really been in the newspaper business for a really long time. And he said, you know, billionaires worry about losing millions. Okay. Like it is not that easy for somebody to just sort of step up and buy a newspaper chain. Like, I mean, rich people aren't out to lose money. And so, you know, expecting some white knight to kind of come in and save what, at least to the outside world, looks like a dying business or a dying business model, I'm not sure that we can pin all of our hopes on that. The situation in Washington with Bezos is a little bit different. And in part because, I mean, he has a different vision for, you know, how that newspaper is going to help not just his business, but also help the community. He has a different view about it, and it's just one property. So it's a little bit different than having somebody kind of come in and take over the Tribune or Gannett or McClatchy or something like that. You know, it'd be great if it happened. I mean, it'd be great if it happened in Baltimore. I'm rooting for that guy in Baltimore to be able to get that done. You know, because every time
that guy pulled out, I think that's what I last heard.
You pulled out of Baltimore? Okay, didn't know that.
I thought so, but that was the latest.
Well, I know that he had been talking about trying to get involved in the bidding for the Tribune and pulled out, but I didn't realize he had backed out in Baltimore. But anyway, every time we have an example of something like that, I think that that's a positive, but I'm not sure that that's the solution.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And having worked for both Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos, for one thing, you have to be very careful about who, you know, pick your billionaire wisely, because there are some who really want to intrude on the editorial product. But also, it is what Greg said, and Buffett has been very clear about this. That, as he put it, you know, newspapers used to be a monopoly, and then they were a franchise. And then they were competitive, and now they're toast. And you know, even though billionaires have a lot of money, they are not interested in throwing it away. And they see the problems of local newspapers, and really don't want any part of it, for the most part.
Yeah. I cannot believe our time has almost come to a close here. Final thoughts from you, Karen, or Penny, or anyone else who wants to jump in. We just have a few minutes. Yeah, please.
Sure. I just want to say I really appreciate the questions from the audience, and I think we talked about the role that philanthropy has played, and we've talked about the potential role for government or taxes or taxpayer supported initiatives might play. And you know, I just wanted to mention as well, you know, for everyone listening in the audience, this is you live in a community where there is a local news organization, and there's an opportunity for you to support it, perhaps as a member. A member or a paying subscriber, and I will also say too, I just encourage you to be talking. Certainly, those who are in the audience who are, you know, at universities, to be talking about facts and the value of facts to our democracy, And finally, I really just encourage people to, when they talk about where they heard the news, don't say I heard, source it, say it in your conversation. It's so important to really say, I read that today in the Miami Herald. I think that we have to start just normalizing that to really acknowledge that local, it takes time and effort and energy and resources to produce this kind of work. So I just wanted to say that.
I just wanted to give a shout out to Julie Tambari, who's in Denver. I got your message on the chat. Thank you for caring enough to be a part of this conversation, for caring about local journalism. And as Penny was saying, I think we're at a point now where the average citizen is understanding what's at stake here. And I think sometimes before you can get to a solution, you have to sort of build that grassroots support and an understanding of what's at stake. And I think we're at that point now. And there's people like Julie and others that are going to help us get over the hump and get to the next iteration of what local news is going to be.
Thank you. I just thank you so much. There were lots of questions we actually didn't get to. So please join us on June 22nd at 7 p.m. For the second part of the Future of Journalism, The Fate of Democracy. It will be moderated by none other than Karen. So please join us, and you can register for that on the Virginia Humanities website. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we will send links and video to our attendees tomorrow in an email. I want to thank all of our guests. Truly, I do see you as warriors for humanity, for that truth, and I just thank you from the bottom of my heart for that work. So thank you so much.